3 years ago, this was the state of the global merchant marine fleet. Record numbers of perfectly serviceable vessels were being intentionally scrapped because the cost of keeping them in the water meant that for modern shipping companies operating on razor-thin margins, they were worth more as a tax write-down and scrap metal than they were sitting around at a time when global trade was ground to a halt. In the 3 years since, a lot has changed, and some of the largest ships ever have taken their place. But perhaps the best way to understand these changes is to understand the fundamental economics of the shipping industry with something like this. This is a USB flash drive, a cheap, almost disposable consumer electronic that retails for around $7. Now this is the approximate supply chain that flash drive took to get to its average end user in the east coast of the USA. Materials, components and packaging crisscross dozens of countries, hundreds of companies, thousands of kilometres, and an equally long list of trade rules, guidelines, and sometimes less than friendly competitors. Even the most basic goods sold in economies around the world today travel considerably further in their lifetime than the people who end up consuming them, and that's all thanks to these container ships. These enormous vessels are so efficient at transporting goods around the world that they've not only accommodated global supply chains that look like this, they've necessitated them. The reason that even relatively basic products like this crisscross the world before getting to store shelves is ironically because it's so much cheaper to do it this way. But this is a relatively new phenomenon and something that shouldn't be taken for granted. Just a few advancements in technology took shipping from an expensive and inefficient process reserved for only the products that absolutely needed it to something that is absolutely needed for almost all products. But this isn't always for the best. A lot of economists have spent a lot of time fine-tuning the policies of globalisation, a divisive and evolving issue in almost every country in the world. But it's probably more effective to look at the changes that made this debate possible in the first place. Global shipping is far from a mature industry, and it's at something of a crossroads at the moment, facing major challenges internally and externally, with talks of stepping back from supply chains like this because of weaknesses that are exposed in the last half-decade. On top of that, there is the evolving issue of major merchant navies operating around the world on varying sides of sanctions, trade wars, and other geopolitical issues. It is a lot, but understanding the issues facing global shipping is a great way to understand the issues facing the global economy. So, what is the history of global shipping and how did we get here? Why are the challenges to the ultra-efficient status quo so serious all of a sudden? And finally, could a gradual rethink of overly complicated supply chains actually be a good direction for the global economy? The problem with understanding trade agreements is that often the agreements themselves are so long that nobody in their right mind would be able to read them, let alone understand the nuances and pick out important details. It's the exact same with news, a barrage of information that is filled with biased perspectives, incentives and blind spots that you don't see if you aren't completely engrossed in the news all the time. And who wants that? Well, if you would rather be informed than overwhelmed, you need to use our sponsor Ground News. Check them out at ground.news/explained. They gather related news articles from around the world in one place, so you're not just seeing the same stories over and over again on different platforms. Instead, everything is really organised and it actually surfaces interesting events from around the world from different perspectives. For example, one of the stories I've been following for years is about Julian Assange and the recent rejection of his extradition from the UK. On Ground News, I can quickly get up to speed using the Bias Insights feature, which summarises key differences in how this story has been covered. Left-leaning sources focus on human rights concerns, centre-leaning sources focus on the details of the legal proceedings, while right-leaning sources highlight the US's accusations against Assange. And if one side of the political spectrum is ignoring a story, the blind spot feed will let you know so you can make up your own mind about how reliable the reporting is. So this way I can still understand what's going on, check my biases, but actually get on with my life without having to live in an endless news cycle. So go to ground.news/explained or the link in the description and get 40% off an unlimited access Vantage plan, which is what I use to stay sane in our increasingly chaotic information landscape. Global shipping is nothing new by itself. People have been moving stuff over water since before we had wheels to move stuff over land. Access to waterways has always been a strong predictor of economic prosperity, not only for the drinking water it provides fledgling civilizations, but also the ability to transport supplies and messages over large distances very efficiently. Even today, the inland waterways in countries like the United States and China facilitate a significant portion of their industrial economic activity because of how efficiently it gives industries access to cheap transportation. Only rail can really get close to the efficiency of moving stuff over water, but rail lines have the disadvantage of actually needing to be built, which for most of human history we just didn't have the technology to do, and even when we did, these lines represent huge capital investments. Waterways, on the other hand, can be navigated by basic barges, and they exist naturally. Of course, this kind of shipping throughout history has mostly accommodated the movement of goods within nations, or at most direct neighbours. But that changed as shipbuilding created vessels capable of exploring and eventually trading across the world's oceans. Early colonial trade was of course very different to the type of trade that takes place today, which is hopefully, well, at least slightly less exploitative, but even back then it still relied on the same basic economic variables. The region where the goods were coming from needed to have a price advantage in producing the goods that they are exporting. That price advantage needed to exist even after the cost of shipping was accounted for, and the economy importing the goods needed to have the capacity to pay for those goods at sufficient scale to make this whole operation worthwhile. In the early days of global shipping, the shipping itself was by far the most expensive part of this whole process. Ships were incredibly small by today's standards, they were also very slow, and ferrying cargo around the world was incredibly dangerous, so the large crews of these vessels needed to be well compensated for their work. The only goods that would remain cost competitive to ship across the world at this time were the goods that literally couldn't be produced or harvested from the countries that would eventually consume them. This was of course tea, spice, gold, silver, and yes, tragically enslaved human beings as well. The earliest companies in the world, at least in the form they exist today, started by taking advantage of the huge margins they could make from the cost to extract or trade resources in Asia and the Americas and sell them back in Europe, which at the time was far more industrially advanced. Even today, the gap between how cheaply a producer economy can export goods and how much a consumer economy is willing to pay for them is a margin that can cover the cost of shipping, with hopefully a little bit of profit left over for the merchants themselves. Now, while this fundamental equation hasn't changed, the numbers have. Obviously, major technological advances took the world from sailing ships to steamships to the modern steel giants that roam our oceans, and as that has happened, the price to move cargo across the world has gone from something many multiples of the initial value of the cargo itself to something almost completely incidental in the end cost of most products. After the Second World War, the global economy was primed for a shipping revolution, as both the technological chicken and the geopolitical egg were perfectly set to make global trade the logical economic policy. Transatlantic and Pacific logistics were a major factor in the Allied victory in the Second World War, and decommissioned Liberty ships, which were the basic cargo vessels used by the Allies to do most of that logistics, were sold to early shipping companies around the world. These ships weren't great, but they were cheap. Even still, global trade at this point wouldn't have been economically viable at scale if it wasn't for the post-war rebuilding efforts in Europe and Allied-occupied Japan. This meant that there was high demand for imports to supply these rebuilding efforts. Eventually, it was hoped that by rebuilding these economic centres, they could also reverse this flow and become consumers of export goods from the USA, and of course there was also the small benefit that prosperous countries would be less likely to fall to communism. The world was dividing into ideological blocs, so just as Western Europe and the USA were trading more intensely with one another, the Eastern Bloc was also trying to assist their comrades. It may have been born out of ideological rivalries rather than strict economic efficiency, but this environment was highly conducive to big investments into shipping, and thanks to a quirk of our three-dimensional universe, those investments started something of a shipping arms race. A ship that is twice the length, twice the beam, and twice the height of another ship will actually use 4 times as much material to construct, but it will be able to carry 8 times as much cargo. This is the square-cube law, and it's part of the reason, amongst many other problems, that small early cargo ships couldn't get shipping costs down that much. Modern ships with 8 times the volume also don't need significantly more manpower to operate. Some of the largest ships roaming the world's oceans today are crewed by just a dozen or so highly trained seamen, far fewer than the post-war Liberty ships and an order of magnitude fewer than the early sailing vessels. By the 1970s, the maths was clear. Bigger was better, and since the ocean is wide open space, the average size of container ships and resource freighters grew dramatically. Shipping companies were more than ever competing on price, especially in commodity markets like oil, raw materials, and foodstuffs. Something like crude oil is more or less fungible with no real way to differentiate between oil drilled in the Middle East or oil drilled in Texas. So the shipping companies that were able to most efficiently move this growing energy source from where it was produced to where it was demanded were easily going to outcompete their rivals. The only real limit on how large these ships could get was the shipbuilding and port infrastructure to accommodate them and the demand to utilise them. Starting with the last restriction first, a ship that can carry 8 million tonnes of cargo may be twice as efficient as a ship that can only carry 1 million tonnes of cargo, but if the routes that the ship is servicing don't demand enough volume to fill that larger ship, then it's all pretty much pointless. That's simple enough, but it again shows the economic feedback loop between global shipping, global trade, and global economic activity. As economies around the world produce more output, they usually trade more intensely with one another. As more global trade is done, larger, more efficient ships can be used to accommodate that trade. As larger, more efficient ships are used, shipping costs decrease, making shipping cheaper, and as shipping gets cheaper, the more intensely countries can trade with one another. Today, shipping costs are so low between major economies that, especially for small goods like chips and capacitors for that USB flash drive, it doesn't really matter how many times components have to crisscross the world, all that matters is finding the cheapest possible suppliers. For larger, heavier, and lower volume items, the shipping costs are still wide enough that it often makes sense to produce these goods locally, which is why building materials, for example, aren't transported as much as laptops. Now, this trade dynamic does have one small caveat. It only really works between major economies, and it only really works if they have access to the ocean, although at this point that's effectively saying the same thing. We have explored dozens of countries on this channel before that are landlocked, But with only the exception of a few outliers in Europe, we always end up saying the same thing. It's basically impossible for these countries to compete in the modern global economy, no matter how cheap their labour is, because without large-scale ocean shipping, this equation just doesn't work out for them. The only exception is again for countries that have goods which simply can't be found in most parts of the world, like rare materials and gemstones with very few other suppliers. The price of these goods is what it is, and the end consumer has to accept the higher cost of shipping, just like the spices from the days of colonialism. Or in the case of those few European landlocked countries, cross-border services like finance don't really rely on shipping at all. Now, just being on the ocean isn't enough by itself anymore. As the global economy has grown, the headroom for larger ships has grown along with it. The average size of the global shipping fleet has doubled in just the last 2 decades, motivated primarily from more intense trade between a smaller number of significantly larger economies. A new trend is also ships that are pushing the limits of size to the extreme. Infrastructure was the last bottleneck for many shipping companies, most notably the Panama Canal. The century-old piece of infrastructure held most ships to a size limit for some time, with most companies trying to make ships that would just fit through this vital route. This kind of ship is so popular that it has its own class designation, the Panamax. But in the last few years, the drive for even cheaper shipping has forced shipping companies to become ultra-specialised and build ships specifically designed to operate in just one ocean. With no hope of ever fitting through the Panama Canal, shipping companies, especially those operating in the Asia-Pacific region, could once again start building bigger. In a period where a record number of ships were getting scrapped for the price of their raw materials, container ships that could transport over 20,000 standard shipping containers were getting built en masse. Of the 20 largest container ships in the world, all 20 were built within the last decade, and these ships often come in batches with 5 or more sister ships being constructed at the same time. The reason that the average size of cargo ships has doubled over just the last 2 decades is because smaller ships are getting scrapped and larger vessels are becoming more and more popular. This also means that there are a smaller number of ports and shipyards in the world that are capable of producing and docking competitive vessels. The USA, despite an early historical lead, didn't remain competitive with cheaper shipbuilders that grew in the rapidly industrialising Asian economies of the last half century, most notably Japan, South Korea, and now of course China. Just as global shipbuilding has accommodated global industry that runs on razor-thin margins, where a few cents in production costs can be worth shipping something halfway across the world, building ships itself has become an industry that just goes to the lowest bidder. These 3 countries were in the right place at the right time to be the current leaders in global shipbuilding. They had lower labour costs than shipyards in the USA, but they still had enough industrial capacity to reliably produce competitive ships. A fine line to walk, and even though salaries in these countries have now increased significantly, they have such a large investment into infrastructure and such a good reputation for building cargo vessels that it's effectively impossible for any other economies to compete with these shipyards because, well, ships are extremely easy to ship anywhere in the world. Now, while this has been great for delivering low-cost consumer items, it's also pulled up the ladder and created an uncertain future. You know the line, nobody can predict the future, least of all economists, but that doesn't mean that concerning trends shouldn't be accounted for, and the concentration of global shipping will have its winners, but it'll also have major losers. Not only could countries that aren't on the ocean be cut out of mutually beneficial global trade, economies that aren't big enough to justify large efficient ships and the large port infrastructures to support them could be too. The low-cost manufacturing of basic goods and then exporting those goods has been the pathway to prosperity for most of the major economies that have developed over the last half-century. But if it becomes comparatively much more expensive to ship out of the new collection of developing economies, the ladder could be pulled up in front of them. Even a country like Bangladesh, which we explored last month, should theoretically have the perfect set of economic factors to compete in low-cost global exports. It's close to other industrial centres, it's along major trade routes, and it has an extremely large low-cost labour force. But among other problems, it lacks good shipping infrastructure, which means even though it should in theory be more competitive than its neighbours, it isn't. Now, there might be some good news here. The global pandemic, alongside other geopolitical tensions, has shown that an over-reliance on supply chains that are at the mercy of ever-changing import-export tariffs, trade restrictions, sanctions, and local business policies might be highly efficient when running smoothly, but like all finely tuned machines, they're susceptible to even small disturbances, causing the whole thing to grind to a halt. At the height of the pandemic, the cost of transporting a standard shipping container between the 2 largest economies in the world increased by a factor of 10 within just a few months. That alone, completely disregarding everything else going on in the world, was an indication to businesses and policymakers that this status quo wasn't something that could be relied on. Now, the idea of nearshoring and friendshoring, where economies within the same region or economies more closely aligned with one another trade more with one another, instead of everybody around the globe, could be a solution to this. Smaller, closer supply chains with economies less prone to political interference should, all other things being equal, make trade dynamics more stable. And that could extend an opportunity to underdeveloped economies that may not be competitive globally, but could be competitive within their region. The USA now trades more heavily with Mexico than it does with China, despite the fact that Mexico is not nearly as competitive as an industrial economy globally. However, while this has worked for one developing economy that is lucky enough to be on the doorstep of the largest consumer market in the world, it's going to be much harder to replicate in regions like Asia and especially Africa, where they don't have the same large consumer markets available for anything these economies can produce. Highly efficient global shipping, just like the globalization it enabled, has had winners and it's had losers. It's difficult to have one without the other, but the trends in the global shipping fleet suggest we're heading towards a future with even bigger winners and even bigger losers. Now, we've mentioned the idea of friendshoring in this video, and the obvious case study for this is the European Union, a group of economies that have prioritised regional trade, perhaps to a detrimental degree, over the last 3 decades. We recently made a video on that, and as always, we didn't want to repeat too much here, but you should be able to click to that on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.